Hello and welcome to the first of our pre-election series, It's the Economy. We start by taking a look at how the macros fared during the BJP tenure since 2014. First, the most obvious indicator, GDP. Here, the BJP seems to score ahead of both the UPA terms with an average of 7.5. But since several economists are questioning the back series of the GDP numbers from 2004-5, let us take the older series. And here, clearly the BJP appears to have done just about as good as UPA 2 and quite slower than UPA 1. This is especially true if you look at the last 3 years, where actually growth has clearly slowed, 8.2, 7.2, 7.0. What's worse, the current government has probably caused a loss of faith in GDP numbers itself. The loss of faith is partly because other indicators show that the economy actually did a little worse in the last 5 years. First, of course, earnings growth, corporate earnings. The last 5 years have seen the slowest earnings growth of 4.1% in the last 2 decades, 20 years. Earnings growth is down to 4% for Nifty companies compared to 10 to 15% EPS growth during the UPA terms, the 2 terms. While corporate earnings growth are seen picking up this year, as you can see, it's coming up to 9%, it's still not even in double digits, and we hope it will be 9%. Likewise, credit growth, that has been the weakest in the last 20 years. For the 5-year average of the BJP rule, it's as low as 9.4% against 15 to 28% average during the 2 UPA terms. Let's take another indicator, gross fixed capital formation. This has definitely picked up in the 5 years of the BJP compared to the UPA 2, but it's just still half of what it was in UPA 1. Now let's take a look at indicators other than growth, say inflation. Here, the BJP has quite clearly a fabulous record compared to UPA 2, half inflation levels. But one has to caveat, global inflation itself was very high during the UPA 2 years. During UPA 2, average crude prices were over $100 for a better part. And metals too ruled very high during the quantitative easing time. They crashed after 2015. Remember the Chinese devaluation time. Also, severe food inflation may actually be a curse rather than really an achievement in the current BJP term. Let me come to another indicator, current account deficit. That has been definitely better controlled by the BJP compared to the performance of UPA. I mean, look at UPA 2 at one point, averaging 3.2%. But the caveat here is the stability in the external front did not result in good exports growth. In fact, look at the export growth. The rate has crashed to 1.9% average for the last 5 years compared to, 12 and 23% annual growth on an average during the 2 UPA terms. Let's come to fiscal deficit. That's another big achievement of the current BJP term, falling from over 5%, 5.3% average deficit during UPA. It's fallen to, a little under 3.7% in the BJP years. However, one must be wary of the latest year, where overestimation of the tax revenues at 19.5% makes this year's fiscal deficit target a little unreliable. Also, loans taken by Food Corporation, PFC, all show that a lot of government's deficits are actually lying in the balance sheets of PSU companies. The BJP government's worst record actually is not in the deficits, but in unemployment. The latest NSSO survey, National Sample Surveys, which the government refused to make public, we have the numbers actually thanks to the Business Standard. Unemployment stood in 2018, look at the peak, at a 45-year high of 6.1%, following demonetization, that is. Now, this is a bad record, but what is worse is it was hushed up. Well, joining me now to take the discussion on the economy forward are Niranjan Rajadhyaksha, the Research Director and Senior Fellow at IDFC Institute, Ratin Roy, Director, National Institute of Public Finance and Policy, the NIPFP, and Maitresh Ghatak, the Professor of Economics at London School of Economics. First up, let me come to you, Dr. Roy. How would you rate the government for the last 5 years on the growth parameter? Good, bad, or middling?
Well, I think there is a bipartisan problem with growth. That is that growth deceleration is happening for reasons that have not to do with the existence of one government or the other, but because the pattern of demand that actually fueled growth for the last 25, 27 years, that is not able to sustain growth. Added to that, you have this indubitable fall in exports, and this in combination obviously means that you begin to see growth slowing down, or the growth rate decelerating. Having said that, the government has done its macroeconomic job in terms of supporting growth. As you just said, inflation is under control, and more important, is not very volatile. The current account deficit is well under control. Exchange rate management has been reasonable, even given the last two oil price scares we had. So on balance, I would say yes, growth is falling, and that's a matter of bipartisan concern. But macroeconomic management has generally been sound over the last 5 years.
Well, there's a similar question to Niranjan. Would you say that getting a 7.5% or 7% average growth is good, but not good enough if you have crude at just $60 for 5 years, a solid advantage for India, and a solid 335 majority with so much stability on crude and politics? Do you think this was good enough or should have been better?
So I think I agree with Rathin that it's a bipartisan problem, the growth issue. I would say that the government has done a middling job. We usually compare with the 2008 boom, but that was a synchronized global boom, which added, which helped India as well. I think the question really is that if the government has these three macroeconomic targets, which is 4% inflation, 3.5% fiscal deficit, and a 2% current account deficit, which is what we believe is sustainable sort of macro stability, then growth seems to be around 6.5–7%. That's the sustainable rate of growth. Now, it's not bad, it's not great. The question really is that, is this all we can do if we need to maintain macro stability? So the question is, how do you push potential growth out from, say, 7% to 9%? And perhaps that's what we'll come to later. It's whether the supply side reforms were adequate to push that growth. So I think it's a middling growth record. I also think that in 2017, when the rest of the global economy had a synchronized recovery, I think India was just at that point of time hit by these two big shocks, which is demonetization and transition to GDP, which did disrupt supply chains, did affect export performance. So I think also that has played into some of that underperformance. Okay.
Well, you both of you have given me some questions which I want to take forward to Professor Ghatak. Professor Ghatak, first, did the government unnecessarily score a self-goal with demonetization? A GST disruption, one can understand. Tax changes will always be disruptive. But if it hadn't scored this self-goal of demonetization, probably we would not have been complaining about growth at all. Maybe it would have been better, you think?
Yeah, I think so, but it's not a matter of me thinking so. If you look at the Government of India's economic survey that comes out at the time of the budget, right after the demonetization economic survey did do it, when Arvind Subramaniam was the chief economic advisor, they did have calculations as to what percentage points of growth was knocked out by it. More subsequent work by figures such as Geeta Gopinath, currently chief economist of IMF, she has done some work that shows the percentage point loss because of that shock is around 2. Now, just to put things in perspective as to, what does it matter, right? 1%, 2%. Think about it this way. You have a certain stock of GDP. You could allocate 2% of that to some sector. Could be defense, could be social sector. If you do something that knocks off 2 percentage points from the growth rate, that's the magnitude we are talking about of the potential lost opportunity and the shock to the unorganized sector, which we all know, given the data collection process, is not fully captured. So that would be my more specific comment on your question about demonetization. I want to make 2 quick points relating to the broad question you asked my friends Niranjan and Rathin is the following. The first is, I looked at the World Development Indicator database of the World Bank, which sort of collects all these numbers from different countries, right? So there is some comparability. Now, of course, CSO has been changing estimates almost on a monthly basis. That it's hard to, it's a bit like London weather. Next time you look, it's sunny, then it's rainy. So that's a bit, it hasn't settled down in a way. But if you look at those indicators, India's growth rate fell below 7% only 4 times in the last 15 years. One was right after the 2008 crisis. Yeah, the 2 more times was in the last 2 years of the UPA 2, which had the same, famous policy paralysis era, and then right after demonetization. So having to claim that's above 7% growth rate, it's a bit like saying, look, I got 50% marks and that's somehow good.
All right, so you would say middling?
Yeah, middling or below middling. I mean,
Okay.
Everybody acknowledges about the sort of negative impact of demonetization, but it's not something that happened, some external forces made us do it. It was a self-inflicted goal, and therefore, whoever was in government has to take some responsibility for it.
Rathin Roy, okay, Niranjan says middling, Professor Ghatak says probably below middling because it's a self-inflicted goal. What would your, score be? Average, above average, below average, and more importantly, the next question to you, the comparison with China is very obvious. At a similar phase, China was growing so easily in double digits. We will never have, we're not unlikely to have such a good majority and such a stable external environment in the form of crude. So do you think we blew our chance to get to double digits or even, 8-9%?
I don't think that at current levels of productivity and given current institutional arrangements within which the economy functions, that it would be prudent to even aim for 10% growth or even 9% growth. I simply do not think that is sustainable. So in that context, I agree with Maitresh that if demonetization was self-inflicted, then there is a growth price to pay, as the economic survey said. But then one has to recognize that demonetization clearly had explicit political goals, which seem to be very popular in people's heads, such as doing away with corruption, getting rid of black money. And obviously, when you do these things, there may be a negative impact on the economy. And therefore, one has to, leave it to people's political judgment whether demonetization achieved those beta goals that government, today uses to justify the measure. On the China case, I've always said this, India is not China. India is a democracy, and therefore when we take economic policy actions, they're politically motivated. We do not have the Chinese luxury of forcing people to live where they live and then issuing them permits to go and work. We do not have those luxuries, for instance. So our ability to adapt to global circumstances, principally to push up our exports, is much more limited than China. We have a different business model. Our business model, I think, is based principally on domestic aggregate demand, and my concern is that the factors that fuel domestic aggregate demand, which are the factors that have been fueling your nifty growth in those high numbers that you mentioned earlier, those factors have begun to peter out. The Nifty will have to look beyond cars, two-wheelers and air conditioners if we are going to grow faster in the future. And until we do that, you will get this bad Nifty and Bombay will be mad.
Okay. Oh, excellent. Take your point entirely. That's what is, I guess, potential growth also all about. Niranjan, you left another question on my plate saying that India could not participate even when in 2017 global growth was picking up. I want to add one more point to it. The export growth has been genuinely pathetic, and we hear anecdotal evidence of many American companies saying that they want to diversify the China risk. They want to move out of China and invest elsewhere. But invariably, the name we hear is Vietnam or even Bangladesh. So are we missing out in the supply chain despite having a very stable polity and capable of taking decisions? So 2 external questions. 1, did we blow up our chance in the global recovery? And 2, are we missing out even the entry into the supply chain?
Yeah, so as I said in the first answer itself, that I think those 2 big shocks came at, in a way, a wrong time, just when the global economy and global trade were picking up. So I think India missed some sort of incremental growth there. About the China issue, undoubtedly means when I meet international companies, there's a clear sense that they want to de-risk their supply chains. Now, there are two reasons. One is they don't know where the trade war is going, and the second is even in China, they're changing their business model, wages are going up. I saw a study by Oxford Economics recently about which Asian countries are best prepared to sort of capture this opportunity, and India comes at number 6. It's behind Vietnam, Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia. So I completely agree with you. I also want to raise one more issue, which is you mentioned potential growth, and I think there are 2 points here. I agree with Rathin that you can't have 10% growth and macroeconomic stability given the current situation in India. So it looks like 6.5–7% is our sustainable growth rate. Now, how do you increase it? I think one big worry, and I don't think this is necessarily linked to a particular government, is the fall in household savings. At one point of time it looked like people were saving less for consumption smoothing, but I think this has gone on for much longer. So if India does not have the stock of savings to fund an investment revival, that is an issue, because that sort of constricts your supply side. And the other is again the aggregate demand issue, that if because of the farm crisis and because of higher inequality, domestic demand for industrial goods is low, and you cannot meet the domestic and the international market, so you're constrained on the home market and the international market. So therefore I think both on the savings part and the aggregate demand part there seems to be a squeeze, and that requires reforms and a whole lot of other things.
Absolutely, and that perhaps, as you say, is not a government related. Perhaps this is a repeated failure. Both of you, in fact, all of you are pointing out to that. The envelope not being pushed on several factors of productivity and that of production, and that is constraining potential growth. To our election special, It's the Economy. I'm speaking with Nirjan Rajadhyaksha, Rathin Roy and Maitresh Ghatak, all three very well-known economists and long-standing watchers of the Indian economy. Let me come to one issue which is so slippery that we don't have good numbers. Unemployment. Professor Ghatak, we have to rely on the NSSO number and just shades of it that the Business Standard managed to eke out. Do you think this is a big failure, not able to absorb the surplus labor from farms?
Yeah, no, clearly. I think that what's going on, and I think Niranjan made a couple of good points about some of the more alarming macroeconomic indicators, such as savings and the falling export demand. I think that the RBI's new monetary policy regime is a good one in terms of keeping inflation in check. But having said that, one shouldn't celebrate what also otherwise can be interpreted as signs of a recession as too much of an achievement. We know what happened in Britain with the Tory government's austerity, right? And then we know the backlash that comes. So some of the farmer distress and the fact that we have very little job creation in both the unorganized and the organized sectors, right? So these are all symptoms of an economy that is kind of sluggish. And for the poorest sections, clearly, that sluggishness actually is much more costly, because they're much more at the margins of subsistence or a very, very poor quality of life. So yeah, I think come back to, I recently did a longish piece in this new magazine called the India Forum, where I looked at various sources on the employment and unemployment figures, and others have looked at it too. So I agree that the NSSO one is the most reliable one, but as you noted, it's unfortunate that right now, quality of statistics was one of the things that, as somebody who has spent more than 3 decades in kind of Western academia, was something we could really be proud of in any discussion, that the quality of Indian sort of statistics is considered to be very high. Now, the whole fact that we have this sort of GDP number revisions, which are going on almost like in a sort of, that you don't even know going on, right? And secondly, with any time something is not looking good, like the unemployment numbers, you have all this back and forth. And essentially things not being released. And also for me, as somebody whose primary work is on development economics and in a much more academic end of things, not the policy debates we are having here, poverty numbers since 2011-12 We don't have any updated poverty numbers. Now, is that a matter of priority? Is that a matter of our bureaucracy somehow not being able to cope up with some of the demands for economic management and governance? Anyway, coming back to your question, I think the NSSO, as well as things such as the CMIE database, right?
Yeah.
These are all... yeah, exactly. And also the Azim Premji University, they also have their studies. They're all pointing to a similar picture. And we are, I think, this unmistakable signs of a recession. And that is very hard to dodge.
Okay. Dr. Roy, I won't come to unemployment because I'm out of time. I want to get the other issue of fiscal deficit. The record looks good, definitely much better than the UPA record. Blessed, of course, because of lower crude prices. But do you think the current performance has left a lot in the plate for the future? Does that mar the record? I mean, every year now we have to have at least a minimum farm income transfer of 72,000 crores. I mean, that's gone if you probably want to build roads or railway tracks, and a number that really is not adding up. So do you think even if the fiscal deficit record is good so far, it has clearly spoiled the record for the incoming government, even if it is the same government, the same party?
The fiscal deficit, regrettably, does not fund infrastructure of the railways. 72% of the fiscal deficit is used to borrow for consumption. So in that circumstance, when you add on a future item of recurrent expenditure, such as farm waivers or whatever the other Congress thing is, I forget, minimum income guarantee, you are going to increase consumption expenditure. Let's get that straight. So it's not at the cost of... So it will either be at the cost of a higher fiscal deficit, which means less money for the private corporate sector to invest, because there's a finite pool of domestic savings, and as long as the government of India continues with its very desirable policy of not borrowing abroad, that pool is finite and may be under even further pressure, given what Niranjan was saying. So either we will have to make that sacrifice, or we will have to replace one form of revenue expenditure with another. So possibly if governments were able to do expenditure switching on subsidies or other forms of current expenditure, then the fiscal deficit would be affordable. Governments are perfectly entitled to decide to redistribute. But there is a problem. In India, when you decide to redistribute, it does not automatically follow that you can tax more and then redistribute. And therefore, you will have to spend less on something and redistribute, or borrow more. And that's a macroeconomic legacy of some concern for any incoming government.
Okay, fair point. One hopes, of course,
given the bipartisan agreement that transfers are now going to be an important part of public expenditure. The bipartisan agreement.
Yes. So it looks. Well, you're right. One hopes that at least in the years to come, GST will stabilize and the pie will grow. But I'm completely out of time. I want one round of rapid fire from all three of you, preferably monosyllabic answers or at least brief answers. Niranjan, what would you count as the success, economic success of the government, and what would you count as the failure of this government in terms of economic policy or economic numbers?
Okay, so the success is very clearly macroeconomic management, and it's not all because of crude and food. I think they have, even core inflation, which removes all this, has come down. So macroeconomic management, benign international situation, but nevertheless a positive. I'm less sort of impressed with the reforms. The reforms which have happened have all been inherited from the UPA, which is inflation targeting, GST, IBC, etc. Now they used political capital to push those reforms, so credit to them. But there's very little in terms of leaving behind a reform agenda, because in India every reform is a 10-year battle. So there is nothing in the future I see. So I think better on macroeconomic management, less on the more structural issues.
Okay. All right, Dr. Roy, I must request that it has to be brief. Success, failure.
Keeping petroleum taxes up when the middle class was screaming from their TV sets to cut them. Great success.
Yes.
Reason for prudent macroeconomic management. Failure, comprehensive failure to even think about reforming public institutions that have to deal with fiscal policy. A very, very important opportunity missed over 5 years.
Okay. We'll try and spend a whole show on that. That's a great point. Professor Ghatak?
Very quickly, I am not, I have already made critical remarks about where the performance has been disappointing. So let me try to point out a few areas where there has been some positive development. So one is something that Niranjan already mentioned, that the bankruptcy code reform, as well as inflation targeting and GST. These are all positive things, which, implementation issues aside, will something that we should acknowledge. And also certain public services, while writing this big survey on various aspects of the economy, whether it's Jan Dhan or rural house construction and some other measures, there has been, again, the exaggerations and claims always. It's unfortunate because even if you let the stats just play out and be verified by independent other organizations, right, there has been positive development. But the rest, unemployment, growth, in terms of livelihood of the poor, agricultural crisis, exports, I really don't see a very good report card here.
All right. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me in this conversation. This is the first of our election series, and the scoring by our experts is very clear. Middling or lower than middling performance as far as growth is concerned. Good performance as far as macros in terms of inflation control and current account deficit are concerned, external sector. But very poor performance as far as pushing the reforms agenda and tackling human problems, unemployment, the farm crisis. The record is absolutely poor, according to our experts. Thanks for watching this special show. There is many more to follow. Now, election analysis, it's the economy.